recorded. Hi, this is Monica Koyu.
And this is Tammy Spears.
And we are with Foster Adopt and trainers. And this is on trauma and brain development and how it affects behaviors. So let's get started. So when we talk about with the first slide, not all disabilities look like this. And it's easy to, a lot of times when we think of disabilities, we can see what's going on outwardly. But with our kids, it looks much different.
Our kids are really cute. And that should always be a red flag. No, but our kids are really cute. They are beautiful people. And you don't see their scars because their scars are inside. So a lot of people think, oh, those kids don't have a disability. They're just, unruly or they're naughty. No, they do have disabilities, and they are just the ones that you cannot see from the surface.
And they're disabilities of things that are going on in their brain, and that's what we're going to be talking about with today. So sometimes it's important to really understand this information, because what we might do is take it personally or see it as a behavior problem, and then we want to correct it or try to discipline it. And if we don't understand what's really going on, what happens?
We send that child a message that we are not here to meet their needs, that we are not here to be open to meeting them where they are. We say that, and we say it in stars, you meet your child where they are. Well, there's a certain level of expectation you have when you look at a child from the outside. Unfortunately, our children affected by trauma, you have to look at the insides as well. You have to look at their life experiences. You have to look at all the things that make them up as a human being. So that big, tall, burly 16-year-old may not be 16.
Right.
He may be 7. And your expectations have to be those of that person that he is inside. And if you meet him where he is, you can move him towards being that 16-year-old lippy teenage person. I'm not sure why you want to do that, but you can just by meeting them where they are.
So one of the things that we need to really understand, and I want this to become your mantra, is that it is our job to parent to the stage and not the age. So we want to parent them at their emotional stage and not their chronological age. Their chronological age is the least of our concerns, because our kids and their brains, as we're going to learn and see today, is full of huge developmental gaps. So what is trauma? Have you ever thought about what the definition of trauma is?
I think we've all thought of what that is, because that was like a new buzzword,
Yes.
When we were beginning this 100 years ago, it was just manage the behavior, behavior modification. But there was no talk of trauma, although that's what was going on and that's what we were seeing every day. That's not what we talked about, and that's not what we learned about. Trauma is a distressing or disturbance in the experience that alters the brain.
Absolutely.
That is like if you were 6 and something traumatic happened to you, you could be stuck there at 6 until someone figured out you had specific needs, meet those needs so that you can move forward in your development.
So know that trauma changes the brain chemistry and the chemicals in the brain. So that we know one of the things is we know that the stress hormone is called cortisol. And when they've done studies, chemical studies on kids, like their saliva or urine, they have been just off the charts with their stress levels. And what happens is when cortisol is used to the point that it is with our kids in survival mode, it becomes like a poison. It becomes very toxic, and it is literally like opening up the brain and pouring diluted bleach water. It kills brain cells, and that is why part of the development of gaps that take place. So let's talk about what trauma looks like in our kids, because I think it's really important, especially for new families, to understand what trauma looks like so that they can be watching for it. So kids can look like can look hypervigilant. What does that look like?
Oh my goodness, that's that kid that's always staring at you or is watching everything. They can't focus on any task that you've asked them to do because they are in survival mode and they are trying to figure out where the next thing is going to happen.
When the shoe's going to drop.
When the shoe's going to drop. Are you going to attack me? Is this going to be something physical? Is it going to be verbal? Is it going to be emotional? What is going to happen? And they almost always don't sleep very well. Because they have to be alert and they have to be aware. And if they're an older sibling in a sibling group that you have, they're absolutely watching out for themselves and their little brothers and sisters.
That's what parentified would be called.
Absolutely.
And they don't develop to be a child, which is going to affect them later on in life.
They miss their childhoods. I will say that when we were fostering and we had much older boys, we had toys for much younger children, and they loved them. Well, they filled in so many gaps with parallel play, with imaginative play. So their brains and bodies were their brains were catching up with their bodies because they were much older, but there were such developmental gaps in there that they had to have different types of play in order to try to catch up.
They have to have that regressive play.
Absolutely.
And so that's not a negative. Well, it's negative for the child, but it's not a bad thing when we see our kids playing at a much younger level. That's information. It's telling us something that's happened to this kid. What about hyperactivity?
And again, I will say that is like bathing a cat. You are trying to get control over something that is just wired to be moving and grooving and going and going and going. And it really is difficult, and you're thinking, why can't I get this kid to be still? Why can't I get this in order? You can't control things like that, and they don't have the ability to control it. So you have to try to alter the environment to meet their needs so that they can feel calm, they can feel relaxed, and they can slow their thoughts a little bit.
Where does it come from?
Well, it comes from your brain. It comes from an underdeveloped brain. It comes from the stress in utero. It comes from drug and alcohol use while they're in utero. It really does a number on their little brains, and when they come out, they can only respond to things the way they know how, the only way they know how.
So it's probably safe to say then that most of our kids are full of anxiety.
I would imagine that they are, because I think they don't come optimal backgrounds, obviously, because you're in care.
Right.
The potential for domestic violence to have been an issue, for drugs and alcohol to be an issue that lead through pregnancies, through early childhood, and all of their memories and all of their brain development there is not an overstatement. I think that that's a very familiar theme across all lines.
Well, they've never been consoled in a ongoing process by someone who's always there to pick them. Yeah, being consistent. Another thing you might see is learning delays, emotional and physical development. So let's talk about learning delays just a second. If you've got a kiddo in school, you can get IEPs or 504s, and that's another training. But
another training.
Yeah, that's a loaded one. But that cognitive part of their brain, that front part of their brain, what we call the upstairs brain, that is totally different. And sometimes when people see a kid that's very manipulative or can control when they want to, I think that stumps a lot of people. It's different parts of the brain that are being activated at the different points. And we feel like the kid can do it now, they should be able to do it all the time. But what that ends up doing is setting the child and you up for a disrupted relationship. Emotional and physical developments. We've talked a little bit about emotional development. On the physical development, do you ever see kids a different size, awkward, klutzy?
I think I've seen so much of that with kids that you would think, oh my God, they're going to kill themselves. Just walking makes me afraid. It really does. It makes me afraid. And that's when you start looking at, okay, what part of their brain has been affected here?
Right.
I mean, because I have a kiddo, and I tell you, he is uncoordinated. He scares me. When he walks upstairs, I'm just like holding my breath. And I'm like, come on, 1 foot in front of the other, 1 foot in front of the other. And then sometimes you can't say anything because he's like, I'm 9 and I don't want to hear you say that, which is fine. So it just makes you, you're focusing on that. And then you figure out things to make him stronger and things to make him better so that he is coordinated or that he can get the help that he needs and whatever services that you need to get for them.
And I think, too, I think I've been learning the last 20 years just how impactful and how incredibly damaging neglect is to kids. It's
almost the worst.
It is almost the worst.
It is almost, you would think, oh no, I think physical or sexual or verbal abuse I think they are much more easily treated than neglect. I think neglect is the horrible gift that continues to give throughout their lives.
Yeah.
Because if, say, food was scarce, their brain, they may not remember it, but their brain does. Their brain absolutely remembers not
having enough. Their whole body does.
And their memories do not share that. So their body and their brain knows, but they don't know. So they have no idea why they
or
are
how
feeling
to talk
food,
about what's
or
going
how to
on.
say, I'm always afraid I'm not going to eat.
Right.
They don't have the capability of saying that, but they will steal food and they will hide it and they will store it away and lie about it. And then you go, what is that smell in your room? And you're in there cleaning up half-eaten pudding cups and, you're finding
strings.
Oh.
And if you don't understand that, that's really going to set you off.
It is. It's going to disrupt the placement because you're not going to be able to, I'm using quotation fingers now, break that habit in that child. You're going to have to meet that need. And it's going to take a long time before that behavior changes because what they know is there was no food and I was hungry. So I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen to me again. And I can't trust adults to meet that need, so I'm going to do it myself.
Right. Another thing that trauma, the ongoing chronic trauma that we're talking about, and developmental trauma, that it can look like mental illness. And this is a really difficult one to tease out, especially if a kid has a history as far as their family, if their family has a history of true mental illness. And I'm not saying that our kids aren't ADHD, but trauma can look like and mimic all the signs because of the anxiety of ADHD. It can look like bipolar, it can look like borderline, it can look like schizophrenia. And what ends up happening is you're treating this kid for something that is really trauma, so ends up just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. Right. Many of our kids are misdiagnosed and overly diagnosed and re-diagnosed.
The rule out.
Yes, yeah, and it's such formative years. And if you think, I tell you, one of my big pet peeves is when people call their kid radishes for a rad kid. That's a very, very disrespectful term, and especially when a kid's whole identity is forming. And if we're saying kid is a radish and this kid is borderline tendencies and blah, 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 we're not seeing the kid.
You're just seeing the diagnosis.
We're seeing the diagnosis, and we're going to miss that this kid is full of needs. And kids do crazy things. Normal kids,
I don't even know what that normal kid is. I'm going to call it typical.
Yeah.
Because I don't think any kid is normal.
No, I agree. That was the wrong word. We also have many misdiagnoses of spectrum disorders like autism. Trauma can look like an autistic kid, especially like when you get into dissociation, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, conduct and mood disorders. So one of the things that we wanted to bring that to your attention because we want you to be aware of those things and be open to thinking that way instead of just a black and white, this kid behaves this way, so this means blah, blah, blah. I've read all Wikipedia, and so this is what this must mean.
Don't use Wikipedia.
It's so much more complicated than that. So Tammy and I were talking about maybe some different things that are really important to do, especially even if a kid's been in the system for many years, they can fall through the cracks. So some things that we have learned through our many years, because we're old, both of us are,
Oldish.
That are good to get done is the first one is brain mapping, and I'm going to let Tammy talk to you about that.
That one is like one of my brand new favorites. Bruce Perry has just done a tremendous amount, and it really shifts your focus when you can get someone that does really good brain mapping on your kiddos, because it gives you a illustration of what's going on in your individual kid's brain. So when they do the brain mapping, there's lots of talking to you, there's lots of gathering information from their documentation, paperwork, things like that. But when they can come, when your therapist or psychotherapist can come to you and say, okay, here is your sweet angel's brain, and the stem looks great, that's all green, that's golden, but here's where things probably started falling apart in his life, and he started experiencing trauma, and this part is not very strong, and this part is even weaker than that part. So you have to start in the order that the brain develops in order to bring them closer to where they need to be. So I think that it not only gives you better insight, but it reduces your amount of frustration because you realize what your kids' individual limitations are. It gives you an opportunity to go, you know, it'd be really easy to upset and think this was on purpose. It's clearly not on purpose. He just doesn't have that cause and effect thinking, or he doesn't have that upper level, he doesn't have advanced, you know, cause and effect thinking or critical thinking to work himself through a problem. And if you know that, you need to structure what you're saying and how you're teaching to where their brain is. Meet them where they are.
Right. We want to set up the kids for success and not for failure, and setting ourselves up for success and not failure and frustration. So the first thing is brain mapping. The second thing that we would really recommend with kiddos is a complete neuropsych, including IQ and cognitive testing for school. And like my biggest pet peeve with this is make sure you get somebody that really knows what they're doing on any of these testings and any of these assessments that you're getting done. Just because someone says they've taken a class in attachment and trauma, you want really somebody that's been around for a little while or that's really been mentored and trained in these types of things.
You don't want that new, fresh, out-of-school person, no knock on that, but you do want someone who's been around for a while and worked with families, kids that come from hard places, and dealt with kids directly that have come from hard places, because they're going to get it innately. And if they are working with your children as therapists, you really want that.
Absolutely.
Because our children can ferret out a new person in a way that I'm not sure how they do it. I don't know if it's magic. I don't know. But they
chew
know.
them up and spit them out.
I smell a newbie. You smell a newbie?
It's a newbie.
Yes, I do. So you want to be careful, and you want to make sure it's someone that can understand trauma and the development of the brain and work with you to move your children forward.
So with a neuropsych, you want to make sure it's a neuropsychologist or psychiatrist that's going to do this assessment. The third thing, so the brain mapping, the neuropsych, and then we also recommend a good occupational therapist evaluation for sensory. This is really critical with almost, I think, all of our kids should have all three of these kinds of things done. It is an issue of cost sometimes.
It is.
The other couple things, too, that can be added in if your kiddo will allow it is acupuncture, if they're old enough and if they'll allow it, and neurofeedback. The thing with all of these is that I would recommend is that you don't do them right away when a kid first moves in. I would give it a time a little bit and let the child get comfortable in your home, and so that they're going to show their true self and what's truly going on. Anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. So we're going to watch a little video clip about neurons and neural pathways, and then we'll talk a little bit about that.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So one of the things that I think is important to understand when we're talking about neural pathways is kind of how it looks on an everyday level, so that it's easy to kind of see what's going on with our kids. I used to work with this one therapist at my last position when I lived in New Mexico, and she would draw these cows. And she'd ask the whole group when she'd be doing these group trainings, have you ever watched cows when they go to drink water? What do? Do they all run to the water hole, or they get in line and they follow? One follows the other, follows another, follows another one. And that's how they walk to the water hole. So if you want to, and so it's kind of like a neural pathway. We go down this pathway and we go down it over and over and over again, where it becomes an automatic process. So what happens if you want to change the behavior, what do you need to do? You need to change the water hole or change the water trough. You need to move it, and so that they will go down a different way. And it's going to be automatic for a while, for sometimes forever, especially with stress, that they go down the old pathway. But if they want to get to the water hole, they're going to have to go down a different way. And that's how therapeutic parenting kind of works. So let's move on. So trauma. So have you ever thought about the definition of trauma?
You know, you think about it as like, sometimes we think of it as a one-time, all-in-all thing. But I think you have to think about it a bit more broadly. You have to think that some traumas are big traumas that happen one time, and other things are traumas that have gone on for a long time. They're reoccurring traumas. So I think, you know, you have to think more broadly than just this one big event happened, and then that's the end of it, and they should be able to heal right up from that. So you have to be really careful not thinking of it in a kind of a flat way, but more of a multi-dimensional way.
Yeah.
It has more breadth to it than just a one-time incident.
Especially what we're talking about.
Right.
So the one-time trauma we would call an acute trauma. And our country had that, the 9/11. It changed everything forever. It will never be the same. And I'm not saying that things won't be good again,
right,
or haven't gotten better, but it did increase fear. And it did increase, safety became much more strict. You know, going to the airport
is a nightmare.
Is a nightmare, and it's never going to be the same that it used to be. And everything's under suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
And And it's kind of like that with long-term chronic trauma. With what we're talking about with our kiddos called chronic trauma, chronic developmental trauma, because it was ongoing developmental, because it creates the developmental gaps, what we talked about, and then it's usually at the hand of a primary caregiver. Right. It's not just abuse and neglect. It could be multiple placements too. So on this third one, we see trauma response as an adaptation to the threat, and then we re-experiencing symptoms such as flashbacks, night terrors, nightmares, and even get caught off on daydreams of the event. I know that when my youngest one first moved in, she was 3, and she would wake up 5 to 7 times every single night with having extreme, just really radical nightmares and night terrors. And so we literally rigged a chair so that I could lean back, and I just held her on my chest and let her sleep there night after night, because she'd wake up, but I would be right there holding her. And that's what she needed to get through that. It took a long time. Another thing you see is avoidance, and that's the suppression of thought, avoiding people or places. I think sometimes we don't realize how painful it is for our kids to look back at what their parents did. No,
because they love them. They love them no matter what happened and no matter what brought them into care. They love their parents, just like everyone else loves their parents. And I think that's hard for people to imagine, given the things that have happened. But those people are still their parents, even though they are the people that directly impacted or caused the trauma that our kids have experienced. Yeah. It is very difficult for them.
I know some of my kids won't even look at their bio parents, or especially their bio mom's picture, because they said it just makes them sad and they don't want to go there. It's this primal wound that's just so deep. There's also arousal, the hypervigilance, heightened senses, exaggerated intensity of behaviors, and increased anxiety. And I think anxiety, especially stress is like the enemy with our kids.
And I also think that we need to recognize that anxiety is like the base plate for trauma.
Yes.
Like that is like what everything in trauma is built on, the anxiety, the fear of something happening. So when we think, oh, our kid doesn't have anxiety, absolutely they do, because all their trauma is based in
fear,
that anxiety,
that primal fear.
Absolutely. So I think if you look at it that way and you treat, whether you use medication or not, you treat from that perspective, you do a better job of meeting your kiddo's needs.
Yes. Yeah. And we're going to learn more about this, that how you have 2 basic primary emotions, fear and love. And all those behaviors come from either a place of fear or a place of love. The aggression, the crazy behaviors, everything. And if we can see that this behavior is coming from fear or love, mm-hmm. it helps to de-escalate ourselves and what's going on inside of us when our kids are acting crazy or really mean or whatever.
And that's what we have the most control over, how we are responding to it.
Yes. Another thing that our kids can do is have a hypovigilance, which is an impairment is inattentiveness, fatigue. Our kids can become dissociative, and what happens with dissociation is the bloodstream is flooded with opiates. In the brain releases, and what it does is it slows everything way down, because what is going on is so crazy and I can't understand it, and I'm so afraid that I have to slow everything down. So one of my kids, when she first moved in, she wasn't quite 2, and she used to have this ongoing dream about a man knocking her out of a boat and holding her head underwater. So fully descriptive for such a young child. And she had it for years. And I think it was like into 3 years after she was with us, we went on a canoe trip. And I was telling her about it, and I was telling her all the ways I was going to keep her safe and how we were going to be right there, and also how fun it was going to be and stuff. And I told her, I said, if you don't want to do it, I'm not going to make you. She was about 5 at this point, or maybe 4. And I said, and Mommy will be right there, and we can just hang out together if you don't want to do it, but I want you to at least look at it. And so she got in the canoe, and she was having a great time, and we had 2 canoes because there were 6 of us. And my oldest son was in the front, and she was in the middle, and I was in the back of our canoe, and we hit these rapids. And not only it flipped her out, but the canoe flipped on top of her. And we were in rapids, and I was hanging onto the back and screaming to get her, and my oldest was hanging onto the front, and these college boys saw what was going on, and they jumped into the river, and they were able to get the canoe off of her, and at that point we were able to get her and pulled her off, and her head never went underwater. And I think this is an important piece. She never was not safe, but she was terrified, and she dissociated, and she was so terrified she was shut down. And when I got her to the side, she was gone. She looked like a little zombie. Mm-hmm. And so I would do something with her called grounding, where I would take her little water socks off, and I would rub her feet in the mud and on the rocks, and I would describe to her, I said, Andy, do you feel the rocks and the sharpness and the squishiness of the mud? And so I'm describing with the adjectives what she's experiencing, and she would come to and start crying, and then she would back out again. And we went through this for about 15-20 minutes, back and forth, and she finally came out, and I held her for a while, and we stopped for about an hour, and we played in the water and stuff, and she decided she wanted to get back in. But that was a major turning point. That's like dissociation to the full. You'll hear kids talk about who've been sexually abused, dissociating from their body and floating to the ceiling. That's dissociation. It's what is going on is so overwhelming, I can't handle it
right now.
Yeah. You'll see kids kind of numb out, kind of have an ashy affect, that kind of stuff. Sometimes you'll see kids blinking eyes. They can have like a seizure type of thing too. That's why a good neuropsych is important too. So let's look at what's going on in utero. So the first trimester of life, which a lot of the biomoms don't even know they're pregnant, those first 3 months, that brain and the nervous system are forming in utero. And if mom is highly stressed, if she's living in poverty, not getting proper nutrition, her system is saturated with cortisol. If she's using drugs, alcohol, if she's in domestic violence, all those kind of things, already that little nervous system is forming around the ability to touch and be touched. It's already forming around chaos. And so a lot of times that debunks the myth that if I get a baby, everything will be fine from the hospital. That's just not accurate, because there's so much trauma that takes place even in utero. When we look at the triunion brain, this is a model of it, and it's basically divided into 3 parts. The cortex, which is, this is an important piece to remember too, speech, logic, reasoning, or what we call higher thinking. The limbic system, which is the limbic system and down into the reptilian brain, we would call the downstairs part of the brain, where the cortex is what we call the upstairs part of the brain. It's higher development. So the limbic system is more about your emotions, and then we get into the reptilian part of the brain, which is all survival instinct.
And that's where our kids are. That is exactly where they are. And they're typically like that, stuck in there, because they can't regulate their limbic system. They can't regulate any of their emotions, and they're stuck in there. We just need to survive. If we can just live through this, if we can just live through that. They've not moved past that part.
Right. And that's why you'll see a lot of times with kids that are going good, or you've had a party and you've had a good time, and then they crash the next day. They're waiting for the shoe to drop. Another thing that's going on is their sugar levels have dropped. And so when you've had certain things like parties or celebrations or things like that, make sure your kid's getting lots of hydration and lots of protein. Every 2 hours, our kids are depleted on those things. And dehydration can lead to aggression. And protein shifts, which is going to affect the sugar levels, can lead to aggressions too. So we want to make, it's amazing. Sometimes when my kids, especially after school, my kids will come home and they're bears and I'll feed them and they're a different person.
It's snack time. And I think that we underestimate. I nurture through food. So I'm always like, that's my jam. I'm ready. I'm ready to snack them. I'm ready to snack them. But that you are absolutely right, because you do see the difference in their mood and their ability to articulate what went on with their day. Like, we don't even talk until they are ready. They
That's
have
right.
their snack. And, and they're munching on their Parmesan cheese popcorn, until they're in that space. I don't really ask a lot of questions because they're not ready for that.
Yes. Yeah. And it's definitely not the time to try to make them do homework either, or to try to get them to have a consequence conversation with something that had happened at school or something.
Yeah, we really work hard on letting school be school.
Me too.
And not bringing that, because I feel like at school they will have had appropriate consequences for whatever their choices are, and to double consequence them seems unfair, especially when they're not doing a great job at managing their behavior at school. I don't want them to have to come home and answer for that as well.
Sometimes our kids are just holding it together, and by the time they get
with
home, they lose
and
it.
Glue, and a wish and a paper clip.
Yep.
So there's no sense in making that worse.
Yeah. So let's look at kind of what's going on. So you see on here talking about flipping one's lid. So if you see the fingers, how they come down over the hand, that's supposed to be the frontal cortex. And when you open up your fingers, you see the thumb that comes across how it does in the picture, and that's your amygdala and your limbic system. Everything below the finger, when you get into that fatty part, that fatty pad part, when your fingers come to the end, that's all the limbic system and down, your downstairs part of the brain. So what happens is a lot of times when our kids are pushing and pushing or aggravating us and they trigger us, we flip our lid because our brain, it's like we disengage from the frontal cortex, which is logic, reasoning, and language, and we kick into our limbic emotional system and our triggers. So we literally flip our lid. I was one time working with these grandparents that were raising their granddaughter, and the grandfather and the granddaughter would get into it a lot. And the grandma said, she was cracking me up. She was talking about how they were both flipping their lids. She goes, it was like two flaming amygdalas going at it.
Well, there had to be fire.
Yeah.
There just had to be
there
fire.
There was fire. So let's talk about, first of all, we are not neuroscientists.
Although we may sound like them.
Oh, yes. My glasses are down on my nose
down
right
on
now.
The edge of her nose. She looks official, guys.
I'm sure I do. So the cortex area, I want you to remember just a couple pieces. We're not going to go deep into this, but it is the important role in consciousness. This is where speech and decision-making are. So language, logic, and reasoning. And this is where relationships are built. Mm-hmm. This is where we learn from natural consequences. This is why our kids do not understand and do not learn from natural consequences, because they are not functioning from their cortex level, which is the upstairs part of the brain. So then we get to the thalamus. And the thalamus regulates, it's like a sensory, it sends out all the sensory and the motor messages. And it regulates sleep and consciousness. And as you know, if you've fostered for any amount of time, most of our kids have
poor sleepers.
Have dysregulation. And if you think about that on itself, I mean, I would get a sleep study done quickly, because when I don't get my proper sleep, I'm a bear.
I would imagine that I'm fairly unpleasant when I don't get enough sleep, and there's no amount of coffee that changes that.
No.
Your body just needs that sleep. A lot of times when you just get children and they are sure and comfortable and feel safe, they will sleep, and you're like, are they
sleep
okay?
And sleep and
are
sleep.
they okay? And you just go, well, I'm going to let them sleep.
Yeah.
But you need to, because their little bodies are exhausted.
That's exactly
from being
right.
hyper vigilant, from their brain going, you got to watch, you got to pay attention. That's almost the biggest compliment you can get when your kid who's hyper vigilant finally crashes, and you're like, yes, I am a good mom. You know, I did it.
It's so true, though, because I know parents have asked me, especially when summer starts kicking in, parents say, what should I get my kid involved with, this and that and this and that. And especially when a kid first moves in, I said, go to the library, get a library card, get a lot of books, read to them, and let them sleep. Because I'm not talking about the kid who isolates themselves and is sleeping out of depression. We're not talking about that. Trauma, these kids are so on hypervigilance and hyper alert that their little bodies are just exhausted. So then let's look at the hippocampus. The hippocampus it forms new memories, and its association with learning and emotions, and it regulates a lot of emotions. So a lot of times what happens with the hippocampus, and then you can see it's the one that looks it's actually two parts, and it's the blue.
Mm-hmm.
It's the blue part, kind of a horseshoe. So what happens, and then you see the amygdala, which is the fight, flight, and freeze. And Bruce Perry talks about an extra F, which is flock for the teenagers when they create mutiny and they come together and attack you.
You know what that mutiny is. If you've had teenagers and you've had more than one, you are aware of the flock.
And that's why with teenagers, just to throw this a little bit in, you never work with them as a group. You try, unless you've got a peer thing going on where you've got a couple kids that are good in leadership skills. You always, especially like kids that have been in gangs, kids that have been human trafficked, you want to take them by themselves. And then you can talk to them. But so what happens is, if a kid gets triggered, and we're going to show you how that works in just a second, it comes up through the brain stem, and then it's going to hit with that hippocampus those emotions and those short-term memories. And if a kid doesn't even know why they're being triggered, or if it gets confused, it's like shakes like a pitchfork, and then it hits that amygdala, and it's all downhill. And
it shakes their memories.
Yes. So there's a little ditty that says, when we're stressed, we regress, and our short-term memory becomes repressed. So when a kid is stressed and you're giving 3 or 4
Step instructions,
yeah. Nope. It's not going to work.
Nope.
And they may just sit there. They may try to cover up because they don't want to look stupid, or they may really not understand and just kind of dissociate. But I've got one that just kind of sits. I can ask her 3 or 4 times, and when she gives me that deadpan look, it looks like defiance. But when she does that, I know.
It really is the freeze. And I have one of my boys, he's a freezer. He is like Frozone. He is on ice on a regular basis. So when you ask him a question, if you ask him a direct question, he is going to freeze, because he's not necessarily searching for the right answer. He's
Correct.
Looking for the right answer for you.
Right.
He's looking for the right answer to give you in this time, in this space, and in this situation. So he is always looking like his clutch is not going all the way to the floor. He can't switch gears. So he is stuck in that space. And so what we've learned to do is not ask questions, but to make suggestions. Do you think it would be better if you did this right now? Do you think it would be better if you did that right now? And so he can follow along with that. And then you can see him a couple of minutes later, like slapping his forehead, like, duh, yes, I knew that. But as soon as she started talking, I thought, oh man, I've done something else wrong. Where do I go? What do I do?
Right.
So absolutely, he can forget his daily routine every day.
My oldest kiddo that we adopted, not my oldest kiddo, but is 17, and he is so quick to go into the fight mode and to go into attack mode that it used to go for hours, but now it's like a flip of a trigger where I said something the other day to him. He didn't like what I said, and he had been in this great mood, and he went straight into reaction mode, slammed my door, and took off. Now, if I get triggered, which I do a lot, I'm going after him. He's not going to talk to me that way. He's not going to be disrespectful. How dare him?
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. But if I give it a little time, and it used to take, like I said, hours, and now it's more like minutes. If I give him a few minutes, most of the time he'll come back around and say, I am so sorry. I don't know why I do that. And even though we've talked about it and stuff, but that's that amygdala and that quick flare. So when we talk about the upstairs and the downstairs part of the brain, I just want you to be really, really clear and understand about how the upstairs is your thinking, body control, where we play, especially with neglected kids, they may not know how to play. There's empathy upstairs. And that is a really critical piece, because a lot of times when we're correcting kids, we're trying to get them to feel empathy or feel remorse for what they did. And a lot of our kids aren't there.
They don't have it. That's not something that they learned. They learned that the world was absolutely unempathetic, unsympathetic, and uncaring, and they could not trust the adults in their life to meet any of their needs or show them how they could think about things or how they could play or how they could relax. That's not ever what they got from their adults in charge.
No.
So they never developed that. And even now that they're 100% safe and they're in safe environments and they should be growing and thriving, they miss that piece. They did not learn how to feel empathy for another person in that position.
Well, sympathy is the thing that most of us have. That's
right.
What brought us into care. Empathy can be taught to a kid that doesn't necessarily feel anything. A kid that maybe doesn't feel remorse, but he doesn't want to go to jail, is going to learn social cues and what's appropriate right. and what's not. We can teach them concrete things. Those are the meeting the kid where they're at. So we know that the stress hormone is cortisol, but the love hormone is oxytocin. And the thing that's really interesting about the two, besides there being, vastly experientially different, is the cortisol is automatic, like breathing and everything else. But oxytocin has to be taught by another human being to be released. And that's what soothes the cortisol. And that's what builds attachment. That's those good feelings. So what happens is in the attachment cycle, when the baby cries and the mother doesn't meet its need and the baby becomes more dysregulated, and maybe the mother is scary, and we go on and on, the baby's never soothed. So the oxytocin is never released. But for example, when I first had my first child, my firstborn, I was never one of those women that wanted kids. I never was going to have kids, so now I have a house full. But
isn't that always the way? Isn't that always how it works?
But I remember the first one and holding him and just being intoxicated with love.
It's like, oh.
It was the most incredible. I couldn't believe how deeply I could love somebody.
That was not you.
That was oxytocin.
Yes.
And when I looked at him in his eyes, there's something about a mirroring neuron. It's like a snapshot. And his eyes looked at my eyes, and my part of the brain that was being ignited was his part of the brain that was being ignited. I was training his brain to release oxytocin, which builds the attachment. So if our kids most of our kids that have been, especially the kids that you see on online, they've been online for a long time, and the kids that have been in the system for a long time, the kids that are really troubled are depleted of oxytocin. So you have a love or a fear chemical going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we can do things with them like meaningful touch, a significant gentle eye prompts that aren't too overwhelming for them. That's why with one of my kids, when I couldn't talk and I couldn't touch them for so long, I shared that I would massage their feet. That was the only way to get that good touch, and he needed that good touch so desperately. That's the oxytocin. Those are the things that they had to have.
And those are the things that you might want to think about doing with your kids that are cactuses. I know
that's a good visual.
Yeah, because you think about, you're like, oh my goodness, how hard is it to hug a cactus? Well, it's difficult, but figure out where you can do that. And you figured out feet. It could be lotioning their arms in the morning.
Absolutely.
Because like that is my pet peeve. Please do not ashy elbows in the house. Please don't have ashy knees leaving the house. And so sometimes our kids that are just really hard and they trigger us and we trigger them, and it's an ugly cycle. You can start breaking that cycle by that good touch, by getting some Aquaphor and putting in some essential oils in it, swirling it around. It smells amazing. And when you rub their skin and you can go, oh my goodness, look how much better your skin looks. Look at that, look at that. But you're getting that good touch in. It does double time. Because now that ashy and going outside making you go, oh my goodness. See that woman, she let that baby go out of there looking ashy. But the other good thing is that they get that good touch. You get that good touch because it releases that same thing
that
for both of
oxytocin.
you. That oxytocin, it releases it for both of you. And when you can have those common, beautiful moments, those are the things, those are your golden nuggets. You hold on to those because you can build on those.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's so good to say because that's our responsibility.
Right.
When we're feeling no love for the kid, we can make a choice to do things to release oxytocin, going for a walk together.
So you're talking about who's driving the train again, aren't you?
Yes.
Because you can do that. You can decide you're going to do it this way.
Yes.
And then, okay, your feelings are going to follow that. They will.
Absolutely.
They'll show up. They're going to get there. But you got to start.
Yes. And it's not easy, but it's not easy for the kids either.
Right.
So this is from the book, The Whole Brain Child, from Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Tina Bryson, and I would really recommend it. It's a really good one. So when you look at the downstairs brain, it's the automatic things, the breathing, the fight, flight, and freeze that we don't even, that's not at a conscious level. So let's talk about the amygdala for a few minutes. So the amygdala is it's two little lumps of tissue way back in the primitive part of your brain. And when our kids are usually stuck there, when they're acting crazy, acting ugly, out of control, temper tantrums for hours, all those behaviors, survival behaviors, there's no logic, there's no language, there's no reasoning, there's no relationship, which is just the opposite of the cortex when they're in the cortex.
Absolutely.
It's pure survival. So if I am watching a horror movie in my house by myself at 1 o'clock in the morning in a thunderstorm.
Because you wouldn't do that.
Because I wouldn't do that.
Right. But if you did.
But if I did, yeah. And you can see the little M&Ms on there. They're watching a horror movie. And I hear something. What happens to my hearing?
It is like magnified.
It is magnified.
You can hear everything. You can hear things that aren't even happening. But you imagine that you are hearing those things because you are now in a heightened state where you have no reason and no logic because fear is like dancing around going,
there's no love there. There's no worry about relationship.
No.
So what happens if I see something in the corner of my eye? My eyes become dilated and I see things much more clearly. We talk about our kids having bionic hearing. And then If my husband comes down and reaches out and barely touches me,
she is 3 feet off that couch.
and he might get ducked.
Yeah. Oh, honey, I'm sorry. Oh, your eye. What am I? I'm so sorry, because you are in that state.
Yes.
And just any little thing is going to send you off like a rocket. And we're adults.
Right.
We're pretty fairly adjusted adults. So imagine what that's like for our kids that have experienced trauma, chronic trauma. So when you touch their shoulder in the middle of that horror movie, that is just probably some of their memories of something.
So I'm not saying that you have to be watching a horror movie for these things. What I'm saying is your senses, all of your senses become heightened and alive for survival. And so what happens is fight, flight, or freeze. If we freeze, we dissociate. We run away, or we come out fighting. So when you see these little M&Ms, the mega size and the standard size, the amygdala is just lumps of tissue. They're not the size of M&Ms, but this is just a comparison to kind of show you what's going on. So if my amygdalas are the size of a regular M&M, which they're not, repeatedly over and over and over of having survival, fearful, terrifying experiences, they puff up. And that is what heightens my senses. But with chronic trauma, they never go back down. And that is why our kids are always in hypervigilance. And even as they get older, the hypervigilance. And then if they have depleted of oxytocin on top of it, they have no chance. And so we have to understand. So I hate to use this comparison, but it's kind of like a recovering addict. Stress is always going to be their enemy.
Absolutely.
They're going to have to understand their triggers as they get older. They're going to have to stay away from certain situations and certain people if they want. And if they don't have, most of our kids will develop sympathy with proper parenting. The ones that don't, it may take a long time. And it's interesting, too, because we know that the brain doesn't fully develop till the mid-20s. I've heard, 20s-ish. But I'm hearing psychologists say now, because of the computer generation and the video game generation, that there's huge, because chronic time on the video game creates developmental gaps. And so our kids, it's even longer into their 30s now.
Wow.
Yeah. So remember, when the kids are being triggered in their amygdala, there's no logic, no language, I'm not saying they're not going to cuss you out. I'm saying
but they don't have the language to communicate properly with you to let you know what they're feeling. Monica and I were talking earlier about my little guy who just screamed. And he has great language skills. But in that moment, in that space, when he could not explain what was going on and he could not get his brother to understand what he was asking him to do, he just screamed.
Right.
He screamed. It was so primal. He just screamed. And the more, he kept trying to explain it, just the more screaming happened. And so when I got him inside there, I didn't talk, because he couldn't reason. He didn't have any logic, and he could not articulate to me what was going on. So we just waited.
Right.
We held each other, and we just waited for him to be able to say, that made me mad, or I don't like him, or I'm mad at him, and I'm never playing with him again. Don't worry, he played with him right after that.
Yeah.
Right after he made him apologize. So, he just he was in that place, and he didn't have the words to tell me until he could get himself calmed back down.
So I had a little guy one time, and you might have, if you've been in any of my trainings, you might have heard me tell this story before, where he just got to my house, and they were there maybe 20 minutes. He picks up this big chunk of cement and just plows this other kid in the head with this big hunk of cement, big rock-looking thing. And afterwards, and after I got everybody calmed down, and I was trying to get him to discuss it, and he had a hard time. He says, well, Well, he gave me a dirty look after I hit him. And I remember thinking, what? And that's the logic. What had happened was there was a perceived threat. I don't know if the kid was playing and made a face that triggered this other kid. I don't know if the kid looked at funny and the kid with the rock perceived it as but he had a threat. He perceived whatever happened as a threat, and he protected himself. And he didn't understand why the kid was mad at him. And we see that with our kids. So when we look at this, I love this, because when you look at typical development, everything's going to start at the bottom, okay? When everything comes in through the brain stem, that's how it filters into the brain. Everything's going to start at the primal part of the brain. It's going to go through the brain stem into the amygdala and all that. With typical development, which is most of our kids that we gave birth to,
right,
or the way some of us were raised, survival is really not something that we thought much about when growing up, because if your parents really loved you, they might, even spanking. They spanked you maybe, but you had that foundation. You had those early days when you were loved and cared for.
When your needs met.
Your needs were over and over and over. And then there was a little more time as you got older. Your parents started teaching you some regulation skills as you learned, and you learned from watching them.
Mm-hmm.
And then it got to the social, emotional, and then you got into higher level reasoning, logic, and all that.
Right.
But with our kids, it's the exact opposite.
Exact opposite. Survival is the main base. I mean, you've just completely flipped it upside down.
Absolutely.
With everything in the same order, sort of, but cognition is so low on the totem pole. Their base is just to live through each day. That's the overlying theme. Can I live through this day? Can I live to another day? Am I going to have enough to eat? Is there going to be something? Am I going to be warm? Am I going to be hot? Whatever that is, it's just survival. And regulation does not trump survival.
My kids still to this day, and it's been a decade and more, will still say, "You look mad. What's up?" Or if they hear Rollin, my husband, and I argue, and they'll say, "What's going to go on? What's happening? Are you and Dad divorcing? What happened? What happened?" That trigger still happens. That's pure survival, even after all these years.
My husband and I, we learned the art of a silent argument. It's funny. Our kids actually laughed at it, but it was very healing from them, because a lot of them came from domestic violence backgrounds.
Yes.
So they figured out Mom and Dad can argue or not agree on something, and no one gets hurt.
And no one gets hurt.
And they still love each other.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we're giving the looks back and forth. There's an entire conversation happening, but our kids are not a part of it, and they don't have to pick a side, and they don't have to be fearful of what's going to happen next. And I mean, that was really, they said, when I grow up, I want to be able to argue just like Mom and Dad. And I'm like, you guys are crazy. But I think that was a really high compliment.
Absolutely.
Because it was something that didn't trigger them and make them feel afraid.
I know that was one of the first things we said to the kids all the time, and I don't think I think I forget about it sometimes, is I would tell them, in our home, you can argue and still be safe.
Mm-hmm.
No one's getting hurt, nobody's leaving, nobody's name calling, and we're still together, and it's okay. I think that's an important lesson for kids to understand. So we're going to see a video by Bessel van der Kolk.
To a trauma survivor, it can feel like the whole world has changed. Life in general often seems scarier and more menacing at every turn, because when trauma occurs, the brain changes. In fact, there are 3 key differences between the brain of someone who suffers from PTSD and the brain of someone who does not, according to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
One is that the threat perception system is enhanced so that people see danger where other people see manageable stuff. And this is not in the cognitive part of the brain, this is sort of the core perceptual part, the very primitive part of the brain. So the primitive part of the brain that basically is in charge of making sure that your body is okay becomes a fear-driven brain. So that's number one. Number two is that your filtering system, a little higher up in your brain, that helps you to distinguish between what is relevant right now and what you can dismiss, gets messed up. So things that other people may sort of ignore or not pay attention to, you start paying attention to it, which makes it very hard to focus on what's going on right now. So you get into the whole issue of it being difficult to fully engage with ordinary situations. The third one is that the self-sensing system, which runs through those midline structures of the brain that various people probably have talked about on your program already, that midline structure that's devoted to your experience of yourself gets blunted. And that's probably a defensive response, because when you are in a state of terror, you feel it in your body. You feel it in terms of heartache and gut-wrenching feelings, and so your body feels bad. And so as a way of coping with that, some people start taking drugs to sort of dampen that system, and other people sort of naturally find a way of dampening that internal response to yourself. But when you start dampening your response to yourself, you also dampen the response to pleasure, sensuality, excitement, connection, stuff like that. So it's very, very deep in the core organism of human beings.
With a deeper understanding of what's happening in the brain following a traumatic experience, we can apply more targeted interventions that can help patients heal. And in this week's webinar with Dr. van der Kolk, we'll get into much more about trauma's impact on the brain, including how trauma changes perception, as well as how to retrain the self-reflective part of the brain following trauma. It's free to watch the webinar at the time of broadcast. You just have to sign up below.
So Bessel v. van der Kolk was, he was the one that came up with the term of the chronic developmental disorder and tried to get it put into the DSM-5. It didn't get in there because PTSD, which probably most of you know, is a diagnosis that was created for the Vietnam vets. It's the only thing that's closely related to what our kids experience as far as a diagnosis of a disorder, but it really doesn't encompass with vets. When they come back and their PTSD is horrible and tragic, but they also still have a foundation of in their beginning, in their early years, where our kids don't even have that.
Right.
So we're going to move on to the next one. I put this in there because I think it's really important for us to have a visual. So if we look up at the top in the black and white picture, this is a 3-year-old child's brain, normal development. We know those first 3 years are so critical. And we know it's not fully developed until the mid-20s. So you see parts that are black that haven't been fully developed. But with the neglected child, this child, from what I understand in the research, wasn't even a child that had been severely abused. It was a child that had been severely neglected. You see the horrible changes, or not even changes, things that haven't even developed, and growth that hasn't even happened in that child's brain. And then when we look over here at the colored one, it is the temporal lobes, which is where emotional regulation is. And you see the difference between a healthy brain and someone who's been abused long term.
And that's really important for us to kind of internalize, because
Yes.
We see what a healthy brain is supposed to look like. We see the healthy, robust colors. We see that everything is filled in kind of the way it should be. And then we look at our kiddo's brain, and we see the big gaps. We see the inability to regulate ourselves. We see all these things.
Yes.
And we have to keep them in mind when we are talking to them, when we are dealing with them, when we are trying to get them to move from one thing to another. And you might think, well, then that means I'm a permissive parent. No, it doesn't. It means you're a parent that's planning for where your child is. I do get a certain amount of heat for doing that, especially with my little one, because when he doesn't have the ability to reason, he just does not. So if I can wait,
Right.
if I can plan, if I can structure the environment so that he can be more successful, that's better for him, because he doesn't start out with this brain with all the full colors. He started out with his little brain missing lots and lots of neural pathways in it. So if we want to build those healthy ones, we have to structure for success.
And so what we have to, and why we do parent differently, we're not going to get into parenting skills this time, but the trauma that was, the brain that was built on trauma is only going to be healed through other relationships. And we have to keep that in mind. And we have to disarm the fear first before we can ever start correcting any kind of behaviors. If a kid does not feel safe with you, and I'm not talking about that you know they're safe, I'm talking about that they have a felt safety with you. Healing is not going, and attachment are not going to happen, no matter how wonderful of a housekeeper you may be, or even a kind person. Whatever is going on, we have to figure out with the kiddos. So this is kind of a thing, what happens with the brain domains, the different domains of the brain. Abuse and neglect from the caregiver impacts the development of these functioning. And what we're going to, you see the attachment, the emotional regulation, behavioral control, biological regulation, cognition, self-concept, and dissociation. And what we're going to focus on is the behavioral control for just a little bit. When feelings get too big, behavior gets out of control. So what I want you to know without a shadow of a doubt is that behavior is information. It's telling you something. And if you follow it and not take it personal, and if you can keep everybody safe, then you'll see where the need is, and then you'll be able to meet the need. So what we see is aggression and raging, self-harm, cutting themselves.
That is very interesting, because I looked at, you talked about the release of endorphins, or the chemical when you looked in your baby's eyes and your baby looked at you. And so unfortunately, self-harm releases, that physical pain releases also chemicals in the brain that feel amazing. And so, it's really difficult when kids are hurting themselves or cutting themselves or whatever, because that's the only good, positive feeling that they're getting if we're not careful in how we are addressing
they control it.
Yeah.
They can control it. It's something they feel like they have control over.
Because they are. They are the master of that. Is your body. You are in control of it.
Right.
So you have it. And then for that endorphins to be released in your brain, you're like, oh, this is making the other pain feel so much better.
Well, and it's distractive too.
Sure.
It distracts from what's really going on. Destructive behaviors, difficulty with self-limits and self-monitoring, impulse control. That's a huge one with our kids. Oppositional behaviors, difficulties with sleeping and eating, substance abuse, limited self-soothing ability. Let me speak to substance abuse, because with teenagers and young teens and stuff, this is one of the things that I see disrupts placements a lot, is a kid that smokes pot. And here in Missouri, it is illegal, especially for kids, and I do not think that it's a good thing for kids' brains. They're developing, and I do not think it's a healthy thing at all. But the reason they're doing it is to try to reduce that anxiety. And I'll tell you, medication is hard to find a good fit for kids. And there's no guarantees. And they are so anxiety-ridden, they can barely function. And so if we can see it as it's trying to self-soothe, and yes, it becomes habitual, absolutely. But what's underneath it is somebody who's trying, and that's what we have to keep in mind about all kinds of behaviors. All those behaviors that make us uncomfortable or freak us out is the child's only ability trying to figure out a way to
their desire to self-medicate, their desire to unplug and pull back and not continue to feel as much pain and aggression and things like that. So, I mean, yeah, that's absolutely what they're doing when they get into those typical teenage behaviors.
Yes, which leads to the trouble of understanding and following rules.
Yeah.
Because normal teenage development is to try to expand the rules and try to push your limits.
The boundaries.
That's their role. I mean, that's their brain. And teenagers, especially, this isn't a training about teens, but that's a huge brain development time. You know, and that's what's so critical. That's one of the reasons they sleep so much, too, is because their brain is just going overboard on developmental stuff.
And, you know, even at our age, which is not very old, by the way, we require, no, we're all smiling now. We require a certain amount of sleep in order to be healthy and productive the next day. These children that have lived with this high level of anxiety, sometimes their entire childhood into their teen years, their little bodies, their little sleep debt is high. I mean, very, very high. So when they are comfortable enough to sleep and try to let their body catch up and feel good, that is almost a compliment.
Yeah.
That they feel safe enough with you to sleep enough to feel good about themselves in the morning and to feel regulated.
And to feel like they're not going to be harmed.
Right.
Yeah. I worked with a family one time that this teenager had been it was one of the worst cases of abuse, and I mean, the family had shot her, and it was just one of the worst cases I've ever heard. And an old farmer and his wife in their 60s adopted her. I would have never guessed it worked, but it did. And he did the most kind thing, gracious, kind thing for her. When he was walking, he put up beads, like remember the old hippie beads in the 60s? Going down her hallway and into her room so that she would have a hero sign when anybody was coming or going, so that she could feel safe to sleep. And I can remember with my kids, taking yarn and going across their windows like an old spider web. And then on top of it, just to be funny, I'd get flavored toothpaste and go across the yarn so it smelled funny. And I'd say, so if that old monster boogeyman's going to come in, he's going to get to be a mess first, you know. And we'd put little bells on there sometimes, whatever it took. And we'd do it together so that it would empower them and decrease their fear to help them to relax. We're always afraid. For years after we even adopted them, they were still afraid their dad was going to come back and kidnap them. So from fear, one of the main outcomes that come from fear is shame. And shame is a lie. If you guys remember the movie Shrek, the first one, and remember when Fiona thought that when the curse was broken, she'd be this beautiful redhead, you know? And when the curse was broken, she said, I thought I would be beautiful. And he said, but you are beautiful. And he did it with such love in his heart and stuff. And that's the lie that shame does. It makes you feel you're not valuable. It makes you feel like what you do is so awful, you can't ever get out from underneath it. And that's where our kids are at. And we have to, and it's and it's generations of shame. So guilt is my responsibility for what I did or didn't do. And guilt teaches me right from wrong. But shame is somebody else's responsibility that I'm carrying that I don't need to. So we're going to show you one last video and then kind of come to a close. And we hope, this is called Naming and Claiming It with Dr. Dan Siegel.
There are studies that everybody should know about that I summarize with the phrase, name it to tame it. So if you're really agitated, you're frightened of being rejected again, or you're really upset with what happened, or you're angry or whatever, in Maria's right brain, I can tell you there's, in addition to right and left, there's, now please excuse these incredibly simplistic statements, but there's an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. Now, I'm fine with that for this parenting book, but believe me, my other foot is in science, and the scientists would see that and go, what? But the fact is, there's a cortical rim where a lot of this higher stuff goes on, and there's everything below the cortex. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your fingers and put your hands over the top, give this a try. This would be in my brain like this, see? And so this would be the cortex where you do all your thinking and planning and all that kind of stuff. If you lift up your cortex, you have everything below the cortex, which we call the downstairs brain. So that's reasonable. Downstairs is just a substitute for the word subcortical, which freaks parents out. So downstairs. And it's the upstairs brain is the cortex. Okay? So you lift up your upstairs brain, you go to your downstairs brain, that's the subcortex. It's the limbic area, and it's the brainstem. These are very ancient circuits responsible for things like emotion and motivation and fight, flight, freeze reaction and your arousal states, whether you're awake or asleep, stuff like that. So what happens at that moment is, if we did a scan on your brain, we would say that your right amygdala and your limbic area and your downstairs brain, the downstairs brain is super active. I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared. And studies show that if you have this kind of presence and of mind, I can get Maria's left brain to name the feeling from the downstairs brain, and you can show that she will squirt soothing neurotransmitters down to her right limbic area, right downstairs brain, and calm it down. Okay, so we quickly summarize that entire set of studies with name it to tame it. And so that's all parents need to know. In the book, we didn't put any of this stuff, but everything is backed up by science, believe me.
So what does that look like? I come to you and I have a problem. What do you...
So here's what it looks like. So let's say you're agitated about being rejected by your friends. So I give you the hug. All I'm doing at that moment, I'm not naming anything. You don't jump to that. First, it's connect, and then redirect. So that's, we have these strategies, connect and redirect. So the idea is, first I connect with my right hemisphere. That helps soothe your whole system, but you're still nervous about going back to school. So then I say, well, let's talk about it. And you say, well, this happened, and she was there, and she was going to go to the party, but she didn't want to go, and then they turned away from me. They wouldn't have lunch with me. And I said, it sounds like you're really feeling a big feeling of fear that when you go to school tomorrow, no one's going to want to have lunch with you. So we're naming fear.
And I thought I was angry.
And maybe you were angry too.
But it helps to have the...
Right, but you have to actually name the accurate emotion.
Yeah, I hear that.
Right? Because we could say, well, you're feeling excited to go for popsicles, but that's wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not just naming anything.
And when you name it, it registers as true. That's what I'm getting at, is sometimes we think we're angry, but in fact we're sad or we're fearful. So by you saying fear, it might in fact...
That would calm your downstairs brain.
Yeah.
Right. So at that moment, then we're using, first, connecting with the right hemisphere. It helps the system get stabilized. You don't feel alone. The next step is to name it to tame it. So I'm going to now help you with my left brain, because I'm going to use both my hemispheres together and go, gosh, I wonder what my daughter's really feeling here. And I'm not going to tell you what you're feeling, but I would say something like, I wonder if you're feeling scared. And then in Maria's brain, the whole system calms down.
So to close, I just want to give you guys something that you can look up and read. Dr. Karen Purvis, which several of you with trust-based relational intervention, many of you probably know who she is. She has a website called empoweredtoconnect.org. And on there, she gives away chapter 4 from her book, The Connected Child, which is really like the Bible of attachment parenting. And that chapter is called Disarming Fear. I would highly recommend that. You can just get it online. It's totally free, but it is going to explain so much, because if you can disarm the fear, that's what it's all about. Thank you so much for coming today and listening to us.
We appreciate you coming, and we hope you'll come back again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.